Welcome back, grade 11s. Now let's continue with our lesson. Now let's look at the third concept, which is factors that influence the choice of funding. We have period of financing. If needed for a long period, might rather use own capital because borrowed capital would be expensive. So obviously as a business, if you need capital or if you need a loan for a long period of time, it's better to use own capital, because if you would opt for borrowed capital, you are going to pay a lot of interest, because the longer the period, the more the interest that the bank is going to charge you. So obviously the factor that is going to influence your choice of funding is the period of financing, that for how long do you need this financing. Now let's look at another factor, which is nature of financing. This depends on the owner. For instance, if they want to use own or borrowed capital as well as short or long-term capital. So obviously entrepreneurs are not the same. It will depend on an individual entrepreneur if whether they want to use their own capital, knowing very well that they won't be owing anyone at the end, or they would rather opt for a borrowed capital, knowing very well that they are going to pay an interest, and depending on the period that they need. Do they need money for a long period of time or for a short period of time? So it depends on an individual entrepreneur. Now, another factor is the amount of capital needed. So the larger the amount of capital that is needed, the owners will have to look at borrowed capital. So obviously, if you are going to need a large sum of money as an owner, and provided you don't have that particular money, you are going to look at borrowed capital, for instance, if it's a lot of money that you are going to need. But if it's not a large amount of money that you are going to need, you can opt for your own capital. Then another factor is availability. If more own capital is not available, the business might be forced to borrow or the other way around. So obviously, if money is available, if you have money, enough money that you need in your business, you can use your own capital. But if it's not enough, then obviously you will be forced to go and borrow and pay back the money with the interest on in a financial institution. Then another factor is cost of finance. The cost of funding is normally measured in interest that must be paid for the funding. So obviously the cost of funding, you are not going to only count the money that have been borrowed to you by the bank. You actually have to also add the interest. Then you would know exactly how much money that you have to pay back. So when you count the cost of funding, you need to take into consideration even the interest plus the amount that you are going to borrow. Then we move on to the next factor, which is risk. Providers of own capital are usually willing to accept greater risks than providers of borrowed capital. So obviously, if you are going to use your own money, then it simply means that you are going to work very hard in order to make sure that your money is not lost at all. So you are going to put more effort, because you know very well that the money that has been used in a business, it belongs to you. Unlike the providers of borrowed capital, they borrow businesses or people money, knowing very well that they are going to charge interest on that money. So even if you fail to pay, but at least the interest that they have charged you would have covered some of the money that you have borrowed. It is always more difficult for a new business to obtain funding or extra funding than existing businesses who already has a good credit record. So obviously for a new business that has just started, it's going to be difficult for them to get funding because they do not have a good credit record, unlike those businesses who are reputable, those businesses who have been doing business for a long period of time or for quite some time. So obviously it's easier for them to get credit. That brings us to the end of our lesson. I just hope and wish that what you learned today does not nullify yesterday, but it does make tomorrow better. Hope to see you next time.